today I want to take a little bit of where we were um, with Brad Jerzak's book and with others, and then kind of mix them with some things that I found that I differ in or I kind of believe in. And to me, uh, this might be the trickiest part to get someone to explain to someone or have someone take an interest and really look at it, because it's going to kind of break from traditional Christian thinking. And I hope last time I said I hope to keep an open mind. I don't know if you did. Nobody ever shared with me that they did. After the first time I did it, it just kind of fizzled off into the sunset, and we kept going. So hopefully you did, and maybe hearing it again today will kind of spark your memory. But before we get to that tricky part, we got to talk about love and what love is, because love in the Bible, love from God, is greatly going to influence how you interpret or think about things you find in the Old Testament. And it's going to influence your thinking today, here on this earth, as you interact with people, as you decide, what side you're on, or what you choose to believe, or who you choose to support, or any of that, or how you interact. It's going to your philosophy about life. As a Christian, if you read the Bible in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's going to be questions in your mind, and you're going to form things, right? Form opinions and how you want to carry out what you believe you're supposed to be carrying out as a believer. So we're going to start in 1 John chapter 4. And 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 to 9, is probably the simplest thing to show who and what God is, being love. John says, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." I always find, I'll read the next verse in a second, but that particular verse, whoever does not love does not know God. As a believer, we all like to think, I know God, right? I know who God is. I know what God's all about. But John says, if you don't love, and love, as we're going to see the way God loves, you don't know him. Verse 9 says, God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. So we read that God is love. And of course, many people will say, oh yeah, but he's also all kinds of other things. For me, God is love. All the other stuff is stuff that people in the ancient days or people today, we pile on to God. We say, well, this happened and that happened, so this is part of God too. Well, God's also wrath. God's also anger. God's also this. John says that God is love, and he doesn't bring anything else out of it. In verse 9, he also says, God's love has been revealed to us. Not hidden. It's not mysterious. It's not a secret. There isn't, there's God's way and then of love, and then there's our way of love. There is love. It's from God, and God showed us what it was through a self-sacrificial means, through his Son. That is love. And it's been shown. Here it is. This is what love is. Go do it. That's basically what God said, as we're going to see. A lot of philosophical thought will say that everyone who does something, and it could be termed sacrificial, it's not really self-sacrifice, because everybody has an ulterior motive. That's what philosophy would say. For probably 1,000 years, people have been saying that. And often that is absolutely true. But I like to believe, and some people might say, well, you have a high view of humanity. I like to believe that's not always the case. Some people do things for others. It could be the smallest little thing, it could be a big thing. And they are actually doing it out of love for another person, self sacrificially, without a motive. They're just doing it because it's the right thing to do. Whether they're believers or not, it happens. So love is played out around the world every day. We just don't see it. I think even when we see it happening before us, even in a small way, we just don't recognize it. It's like we have a blinder on, not even there, because we have a different view of what love, according to God, is. Thinking of God's love as a secret or mysterious or something we can't do or understand, I believe, is a form of self-protection because we feel guilty. If we don't want to feel guilty because we don't love, so we come up with something like, well, I can't really love like that because it's God. Uh, Worse to me is that it's because we just don't want to love, right? There's somebody we know, a group of people we know, uh, a nation we know, whoever. Could be anything. Could be your boss, your neighbor, country north of the border, south of the border, whatever. The next state, the next town. We don't love them. And we don't want to love them because they're this, and they're this, and they're this, and they're this. So we shut it off, right? And if someone says, well, you love them because that's what God said to do, you desire their well being, you're self sacrificial towards them no matter what they do because that's what God, well, that's God. I'm not God. His love is mysterious. How he does that, I don't know, but I can't do that. That's what people do, whether they do it consciously or unconsciously. As we're going to get into this, some people would say, probably most of Christianity would say, that in the Bible, from page 1 to the end, is displaying the love of God has for men. No matter what God did or what the Bible says he did, it's somehow love. And even though it might not appear as love to us, because it's not what we would do if we love somebody, it must be some mysterious way that God is working with love. And a lot of people would say to discount that would be somewhat heretical. But in Ephesians chapter 5, and I'm just going to read verses 1 and 2. You can turn there if you want. It says, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and live in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. When you read this verse, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, notice what's lacking. Paul doesn't say, try to be imitators. He doesn't say, you can never be an imitator, but do your best. He says, imitate God. Imitate God. So, to me at least, Paul is saying, I can, in some way, imitate God. Even though God is God, perfection, something about God that I can imitate. And that's pretty amazing. Because most people would probably say, no way. You can't imitate God. God is God. But I think we can. So to claim that the love of God is mysterious and intangible, to me, is to show that you are unwilling to imitate God. You're unwilling to manifest who God is towards each other and towards others. If Paul's words aren't enough and John's aren't enough, what about Jesus? The Word. Remember, Jesus is the Word, right? He is sharper than any two-edged sword, right? Comes in Revelation. The sword is coming out of his mouth. And some people say, wow, it's coming out of his mouth. He's going to destroy the unrighteous. All these things are going to happen. You know, they're going to fill my coffee. They're going to wade in blood. It's going to be so bad. But they don't understand what that sword is for. That sword is to take the conscience that God gave you and separate it from the world and worldly thinking so that you can fulfill a reality. And Jesus is trying to awake us to that reality, as Paul was. In Matthew 5, which we go to often, in verses 43 and 48, he says, "You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." I used to read that and say, be perfect? What is he talking about? He's telling me to be perfect like his Father, who is God. I even think of Jesus. How can I be perfect like Jesus? How can I be perfect like God? Well, in the context of those verses, what is he saying? Love. That's perfection. To love. And again, to say, well, I can't love that way. That's just discounting that God's saying, you can love the way I love. You can. It is in your capability as a human being to love that way. He's not saying you're going to be sinless and you're never going to do anything wrong. He's just pointing out one thing: love. That's it. That is perfection. So, I could be perfect sometimes, right? I don't want to be perfect all the time. But I can wake up every day with the intention of saying, today, I am going to imitate God. And at some point, thinking about it or not thinking about it, actually imitate God. Not that I'll do it all day. Like I said, it doesn't have to do with sin or being perfect and not doing wrong things. It has to do with perfection in love. And then Jesus says in John 13, you can turn over there. And we're going to read verses 34 and 35. Of course, he's talking to the disciples. He knows soon his time is going to be the end, and he's not going to be with them, and he's giving them something. He says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So how do we know that we're imitating God? That we're having the perfection that the Father has? If we love. And if you see someone else loving, then you know they have the Father. Something is in them and it's making them do something that is perfection, or doing something that is showing that they have the same love that the Father had. I don't think it could be any more plain, to me anyway. If you go to 1 Corinthians, we're not going to go there, chapter 13, and I'm just going to read a couple things out of it. Starting in verse 4, you read what love is. It's patient, it's kind, it's not envious, it's never boastful, it's never arrogant, it's never rude. Love never insists on its own way. It always makes room for the other person. Always. Even if you come to a compromise together. Whatever you're doing, that to me, when the compromise happens, that's love and love meeting together. It's saying, I know what you want. We'll do that. And then the other person says, well, I know what you want. So we'll do that. And this is how we can do both. That's love. It's never irritable or resentful. It doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing, it rejoices in truth. And then he says, of course, that it always believes all things, it hopes all things, endures, and it never ends. So if you want to know a little more detail about love that is God, that's a great passage to go to. Because all those things that it says, that's God. He's never irritable. He's never rude. He never just insists on his own way. To me, that's painfully obvious if you read through at least the history of Israel and go through history of people who are believers that say they have a relationship with him. We can see that he doesn't insist on his own way. The only thing he insisted on was self-sacrifice and love. That's what he's insisting on. That's his commandment. So what about people? Because we said you can see love all over the place. What about people that aren't believers? What if I know someone who's an atheist? I know some people who claim to be atheists, but I see acts of love in them. Can you say that's from the love of God if they don't believe in God? Because most people would say, well, they don't have God. How can they love like God? Turn over to Romans chapter 2. God has imparted something in everyone, a conscience. And I think that I believe that the basis of that conscience is love. Now, the conscience could go all different ways, depending on their experience in life, things they were taught, things they believe. But God put something in every single person. It says, when the Gentiles who do not possess the law do instinctively what the law requires, these, though not having the law, are a law to themselves. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them. So that conscience is in there, and sometimes it accuses them. And they feel guilty and like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. I should have done this for that person, or I should have acted in a different way. Or they might say, well, I don't need to worry about it. It says excuse. Their conscience might excuse them. So they might start thinking about how they're not guilty of something. But Paul is saying that in everyone, even the Gentiles, and at this point, the Gentiles, because he's writing to Jewish leaders and Jewish folks, and he's trying to teach them something about judging if we read around it. And he's saying, even the Gentiles, even those people that are dogs, even the people that have nothing to do with what you believe in, or maybe even nothing to do with God, God puts something in them. And what is in them allows them to do what the law requires. Now, what's interesting, one interesting thing to me, and maybe someday I'll do something on this, but I have never done it, so it would take me some time, but everywhere in the New Testament where we see the law, what is the law? When you read this, you might think, well, he's talking about the law from the Torah. But when you read the law in the Torah, you have to wonder, in the Gentiles' heart and conscience, all of that stuff is in there, so they just do it? Or is Paul narrowing this down because later in Romans, he's going to talk about love and law and how everything comes down to love, loving your neighbor, loving God. And so sometimes when I read this, in my mind, I want to say, I don't think he's talking about necessarily talking about all the laws of the Torah. The other morning on the way to work, I was listening to First John. He starts talking about commandments. If you love him, you're going to do his commandments. If you do his commandments, you're in him. And I just, in my mind, I'm like, what does he mean by commandment? What commandment is John talking about? And instantly, the first thing that pops in my mind is the law. And I think, well, is John really talking about doing everything in the law as far as commandments? Or is he talking about a narrow thing? It's interesting to think about that. Sometimes I think we get too wrapped up in the law and what it is, or what's actually being talked about in the New Testament as we read about it. Maybe Paul is talking about in the conscience something closer to the Ten Commandments. Because you can go through the Ten Commandments and read each one of those and say, well, that's love, that's love, that's love, that's love, that's love. You can match them up with 1 Corinthians 13, right? You don't do wrong to anybody. Well, you shall not murder, right? You don't steal, you don't covet, you don't do all those things because you love your mother and father. You do all these things. You love God. That's love. What he's talking about. So it's an interesting thought to think about if you ever have time. But some of the law, and that's what we're going to go into here, some things in the law are revolting to the conscience. I don't think most people think about it that way. They read the law, and they read it says, well, God said, or God told Moses to say, if God is love, then somehow that's love. But is it? That's the question you have to ask. Does it line up with what the cross shows? Does it line up with what 1 John says, that God showed love by being a self-sacrificial lamb? Some people just don't think about it. They don't read it. They don't really realize everything that's in there. Or if they read it, they're kind of like, whoa. But then they just think, well, it's in the Bible. It's God. So, and they just keep going. And you could read all kinds of commentaries and many things about it. And when you start talking this way, it kind of starts muddling things in people's minds, and they might be dismissive of you. So if God is love, and he has put that conscience in us of love, and said, go out and imitate me, and do what I do, and you read some of those things, I can see in the world today, and in the world since then, that we have definitely gone out and did those things. It happens in the world every day. And Christianity accepts it and even embraces some of it. So do we have to accept it as it is? Or should we think about, God put a conscience in me, and the basis of that is to love. I'm supposed to imitate. Jesus said I'm supposed to love my neighbor and love my enemy, because that is what the Father does, and that's perfection. Then how do I line that up with some of the other things I read? Now, in the book we're talking about, by Brad Jerzak, this is one of the questions that gentleman asked. And what we're going to read now is some things that are kind of close to what we read in Hosea 6:6, which is about God desiring steadfast love or mercy. And he didn't desire sacrifice. But most people would say God did desire sacrifice. He commanded sacrifice. He's simply saying that you're not doing all the other things, and you're supposed to be loving. But if you did all that and did your sacrifices to cover up when you didn't love, then things would be okay. But because you're blatantly not loving, then I don't accept your sacrifices. So God was looking for, as David said once, a contrite and repentant heart or spirit. And if so, then sacrifice might not be necessary, even though he commanded it. And so through the Old Testament, you can find passages that kind of seem to go back and forth on the sacrifice system, or I'll say ritual sacrificial system. Um, what is God driving at? Turn over to Jeremiah chapter 7. It's verse 21. It says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat the flesh. For in the day that I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, I did not speak to them or command them concerning burnt offering and sacrifice. But this command I gave them: obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk only in the way that I command you, so that it will be well with you." Yet they did not obey or incline the ear, but in the stubbornness of their evil will, they walked in their own counsels and looked backward rather than forward. From the day that your ancestors came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I have persistently sent all my servants, the prophets, to them day after day. And what happens to the prophets? Jesus said, you kill them, because they're telling you something that you don't want to hear. They're telling you how to go forward, but you want to go backward. I think this passage is very full and has much opportunity to read behind what's being said. There's a lot going on here. God's saying something very major about them. He says that he didn't speak to them about sacrifices. It says he didn't command them. He didn't talk about it. And some people might say, well, it says in the day that they left Egypt. But then when he says in the day you left Egypt until today, he never says in between there somewhere, I told you to make sacrifices. He says, I told you. I never said that. I just said, do what I'm telling you to do. And they went backwards in the counsel of their own will. If Israel was brought out for a point of showing God's love and who God is, what is part of going backwards? Part of going backwards was going back to what they were before, which was eventually, if you keep going back, a family and a man who came out of another land where they did sacrifices and rituals and all kinds of other things and had all kinds of laws. And some of that, I think God is saying, you brought with you. And instead of going forward away from all that, you went backwards. And you kept following your own counsel and you kept going back. And so I kept sending people to you to say, you're doing it the wrong way. And what happened? They still went the wrong way. He says to begin with, in the first verse, 21, what he's saying is, you're doing your sacrifices, but you're also doing other sacrifices to other gods. Just mix them all up and eat it all. You may as well. We got laws in your books about not eating this sacrifice or not eating that one, or the priest gets to eat this, or his family gets to eat this, or you can't eat this one. Just do it. Eat everything. What's the difference? I think that's what God's trying to tell them. And that's when he says, I never asked for any of that. Immediately, people's mind are going to go to the law and the Torah and all the things about sacrifice. And we might think, well, when he says, follow my commandments, we might think, well, commandments, that goes straight back to the Torah. But I wonder, when I read it, is he talking about all the laws in the Torah? Or is he talking about when Moses was up on the mountain and came down with 10 simple laws, what we call the 10 Commandments, that were added on to, and added on to, and added on to a total of, I'm going to put this down here before I just launch it off the stage. Before, they added 613 other laws to it. And then after that, adding things to it. I think some of that at least, could be from their own counsel. All this to me is super interesting, and it might not be to you, but I think it bears thinking about. So in Brad's book, he gives several examples of things from the law in the Torah. I just chose one for our purposes because we don't really have time to do all of them. You really should get the book, read it, because you'll read all these things. I added a lot into this today, but you'll read the ideas that he's coming out with. So one example that we're going to use is what to do after a battle. If you go to Deuteronomy 20 and 21, there's ordinances. When Israel goes to battle, what's the law? When the battle's done, they have all the spoils, what are they supposed to do with it? And so there's things in there that tell them what to do with it. One thing is that women and children might be spared depending on their nationality. And if a man, this is how I take it when I read it, if men or a man, a soldier who went in and captured women and they thought one was beautiful, they could keep her. So how do we know that? Well, we go to, and we're not going to go to it today, you write it down and go read it, Numbers 31, 13 to 18, and then I also have verses 30 to 35. I read them again this morning. But this is how I think about it. Am I to understand and defend what seems to me to be implausible reasonings with someone who has a conscience that this is what God expects? The women were to be separated in two groups. This is after they went and they had a big battle against Midian. They burned the town. They took a lot of people captive. The passage starts off with how many sheep they got, how many goats they got, and all these things. And then they get to a part about people, and there's women, and they're separated from the men. The women then are separated into two groups. One group is all the women who had ever slept with a man. The other group is all the women who were virgins, never slept with a man. The first group, all the women that slept with men, were killed. The second group, all the virgins, were saved. All the men of Israel got to divide up the virgins. In Numbers, it says, in this case, there were 32,000 virgins. So they took out of the 32,000, and they decided who was going to get who. 1 out of every 50 of the women went to the Levites. To me, that never makes sense. Because the Levites were the priests. So each priest, or family of the Levites, got a virgin out of every 50 women. So they got some of them at least. Went to them. To me, now you could say, well, back then things were different. You're right. Back then, things were different. Cultures were different. People thought of women differently. Right? Women weren't necessarily cherished. They were at home. They made the food. They took care of the kids. They did the biddings of the man. They did all. That's not to say that the men and women didn't love each other, because I'm sure they did, because God made people to love. But it was a different culture. So some people might say, well, that's in there because that's how they were. But my question to that is how they were. But what was the point of Israel? To be different than how they were. To me, something like this is sameness. It's going backwards. So how could you read that and dig into the conscience that God gave each and every human being and just take that as something God commanded? I think that's something you have to think about deeply, because they weren't supposed to be like everyone else. They weren't supposed to worship the other gods. They weren't supposed to do the ritual sacrifices other gods did. They weren't supposed to have the same type of laws. None of that. I spent some time a while ago comparing the laws of Hammurabi to the laws of the Mosaic Law. They're not all the same. But there are many in there that are almost exactly the same. So I want to be careful and not say that Moses just copied the law from the other nations. There must be something in there from God, some things at least. But there are other things I can read and I can say, does that line up with who I know God is? And if it doesn't, then I have to at least think about it. Why is it in the Bible? Maybe it's in the Bible so I can read it and see a whole nation of people who were supposed to be following God that went backwards and started following things from the old world and learn from it and say, okay, this is what they did. But is it what God told them to do? Or is it one of the points where they went backwards and did what they wanted to do? I think you really need to ask yourself that. Some people won't, because they have a different view of the Bible and what we call the scriptures, that everything in there was not inspired or inspirational, because we know the meaning of inspire versus the meaning of dictate. It's different, right? In Matthew chapter 7, and this is where we're going to close, and then next week we'll pick up on these ideas about sacrifice again. Matthew 7, verses 12 to 14, it says, "In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. For this is the law and the prophets." Now, I could read that verse and say, okay, well, that's the law and the prophets. Israel attacked Midian, and they did all these things. Well, they know that if Midian attacked them, they would probably do the same thing. So they were doing like to each other. But God's not saying do like to each other. He's saying do to them what you would have them do to you. Would the Midianites want that to happen to their young girls? For different reasons? Probably not. And he says, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it. I've read many things about these verses and heard many things of what they apply to or what they mean. But think about it in a different way. There's a wide gate. That's the ways of the world. Easy. Just to go with the ways of the world. And there's a narrow gate. And that's the way of God. That's the way of love. That's the way of the conscience that he put in us, that he wants to come out, that we hide and block for various reasons. But that is the gate, that little narrow one of love that's actually really huge. Once you get, I think of it, once you get through the little gate and push yourself through it, it's bigger than the wide gate. That's life. And we're afraid of it because that life could mean inconveniences for us, pain for us. It could even mean death for us, depending on the situation. People die for love, for other people, for the well-being of other people. You think about war, of course. People go out and they sacrifice themselves for something they believe in. Christians in countries today that suppress Christianity die for their belief. And they won't say, no, I don't believe in God. And so they were killed. They're killed for it. That is the narrow gate. He says the narrow gate is hard, but it leads to life, and there are few who find it. Few. That's something to think about. Are you finding life? Are you willing to find life as it is in God and love and who he is? So we'll close that for today. But I encourage you to get this week, before the next one, think about it. At least open your mind to what you're reading in the law compared to love. Because there's something there. There's more there than what we've always thought, I believe. Amen.